The night Genevieve Hartwell walked back into the Colforth ballroom, she carried nothing with her except a child's forgotten shawl and the quiet certainty that she was not supposed to be there at all. The candles in the great chandeliers had been lit for 2 hours. The room held perhaps 200 people in silks and powder, and the particular confidence that comes with never having been told one does not belong. Genevieve moved along the near wall, her gown the color of pewter, plain enough to be invisible among so much satin. She had almost reached the far corridor when she heard her name spoken aloud, not as a question, and not in kindness. And everything in the room seemed to slow by half a breath. The voice belonged to James Weston, Duke of Ashford. He was standing in the center of the floor, and he was looking directly at her. The 200 people between them had already begun to turn. She had not expected him to come back. She had not expected anyone to come back. What she could not yet know was that he had crossed London in a hired carriage to find Mr. Aldous Prewitt before the evening began, and that the folded paper in the solicitor's coat pocket contained something her stepmother had spent 2 years trying to bury. But that came later. To understand what it meant, one must begin where she began, which was at the edge of everything, and entirely alone. 2 years before that evening, Genevieve had stood in the entrance hall of Hartwell Grange and watched 2 men from her father's estate carry the family portrait down from the upper landing. She had been 21 years old, and her father had been dead for 19 days. The painting was large, nearly 4 feet across, rendered in oils that had taken the better part of a summer to dry, and it had always hung at the top of the stairs where the morning light caught it. It showed her father in his brown coat, her younger half-sisters in their white frocks, and, at the left edge, a young woman in a pale dress with dark hair dressed close to her head. That young woman was her. Lady Dorothea, her father's second wife and the mother of the half-sisters, had watched the portrait's removal from the foot of the stairs, with her hands folded and her expression perfectly composed. The man she had engaged to do the alteration was a journeyman painter from Ipswich, not the original artist. He would, Dorothea explained to no one in particular, simply address a matter of proportion in the composition. The figure at the left edge would be overpainted. The background would be extended. It would look, she said, as though it had always been that way. Genevieve said nothing. She had learned, over the 2 years of her father's slow decline, that Dorothea's certainties were load-bearing walls inside which everyone in the household was obliged to live. Her father had loved Dorothea's energy, her facility at managing a house, her capacity to charm the neighbors. He had not seen, or had not wished to see, the deliberate smallness she applied to his eldest daughter. The way a name withheld from the dinner conversation was as effective as a slap and far more deniable. The portrait was carried out. Genevieve's name was removed from the household ledger the following Thursday. Dorothea did not trouble herself to explain the reasoning. She had already begun referring to Hartwell Grange as her own establishment, had already communicated to the local solicitor, Mr. Prewitt, that she would be managing the estate accounts until the matter of the entail was settled. What Dorothea did not know was that Genevieve's father, in one of the last coherent weeks of his illness, had caused a deed to be drawn up and witnessed, settling Hartwell Grange, valued at approximately £3,000 upon his eldest daughter directly. Mr. Prewitt had kept his own copy. He had not yet found the occasion to produce it. Genevieve left Hartwell Grange in October with a trunk and £40 and a letter of introduction from her father's old friend, Mrs. Pendleton, who had a house in Marylebone and required a companion. The work was decent. She kept accounts, read aloud in the evenings, accompanied Mrs. Pendleton to morning calls and afternoon concerts, and was compensated with her board, her laundry, and £12 a quarter. She did not think about the portrait. She thought, with great regularity, about Clara. Clara was Mrs. Pendleton's ward, not Genevieve's, but she was 8 years old, and she had the particular quality of a child who has been placed in rooms designed for adults and told to be small. She arrived at Marylebone in November, sent down from the Duke of Ashford's townhouse in Grosvenor Square because her guardian was traveling and his housekeeper had decided she was too much trouble for the winter. She had 2 dresses, both too short, and she spoke in a voice so carefully controlled that the first time she laughed at a thing Genevieve said, the sound startled both of them. Genevieve was not supposed to form an attachment. She understood that. Clara was the Duke of Ashford's ward, not a child for a lady's companion to claim. The Duke would come back from the continent in spring, and Clara would be sent back to Grosvenor Square, and that would be that. Genevieve knew this. She read to the girl anyway, every night before supper, from a volume of natural history with colored illustrations she had found in Mrs. Pendleton's library. They discussed the migration of birds and the composition of clouds, and whether fish, in Clara's opinion, were capable of happiness. Clara considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She had decided they probably were not, but that this was no great tragedy, since fish had very little memory. Genevieve told her that sounded like a blessing, and Clara looked at her very steadily and said she thought so too. That winter settled into a shape Genevieve had not expected. Useful, quiet, bearable. Then spring arrived, and with it the season, and with it the Duke. If you have ever found yourself watching this kind of story and wondering how the weight of a single person's attention can change the air in a room, leave a thought in the comments. The watching matters, even when no one seems to notice it is happening. James Weston was 31 years old and had inherited his title at 24, and the 7 years between those facts had produced the particular stillness of a man who had learned that his feelings, unguarded, carried consequences he could not retrieve. He was not unkind. He was careful, which in a man of his position read as the same thing to anyone who did not look closely. He stood precisely 6 feet in height, had a jaw and a brow that portrait painters tended to render in geological terms, and he spoke in declarative sentences so short and level that they arrived like documents rather than conversation. Genevieve saw him first at the Fairfax reception in May, on the arm of no one, with Clara at his side in a new dress that fit properly. She noted that the dress was new, understood that he had attended to it before attending to anything else about the evening, and filed this fact away with the precision of a woman who has learned to read character from the evidence people do not know they are producing. He did not notice her. At least, that was what she believed. What happened at the Fairfax reception was this. A young woman named Miss Cecily Vane, who had very good teeth, and a mother who had been campaigning for the Duke's attention since January, found herself standing near Clara and remarked to her companion, in a voice calibrated to carry, that some children were raised to be seen in polite company, and some were not, and that it was rather a pity when the latter were brought to a gathering of this kind. Cecily did not address this remark to Clara. She did not have to. Clara heard it. Genevieve, who was standing 4 feet away near the refreshments table, saw the child's face close like a book being shut. She crossed the distance without pausing to consider whether crossing it was wise. "Miss Vane," she said, because she knew the name from Mrs. Pendleton's commentary on the social landscape of the season, "I believe you dropped your handkerchief." Cecily had dropped nothing. She looked at Genevieve with the particular expression of a woman assessing a threat she had not anticipated from a direction she had not considered worth watching. Then she looked at the handkerchief Genevieve had produced from her own pocket, which was plain lawn and bore no embroidery at all. "That is not mine," Cecily said. "I must be mistaken," Genevieve said pleasantly. She tucked the handkerchief back into her pocket and turned to Clara. "I believe Mrs. Pendleton wished to show you the conservatory. The orchids are quite unusual. Shall we go?" Clara took her hand without a word. Across the room, the Duke of Ashford had turned slightly from his conversation. He was watching the small figure of his ward moving toward the conservatory door, the hand she held, the angle of the woman beside her. He said nothing. His companion, a man named Lord Festing, said something about the price of wool. The Duke responded appropriately. His eyes did not follow them into the conservatory. He did not permit them to. What he felt, in the moment before he reasserted his discipline, was something he would not have named even in private. A quick particular attention. The way a man looks twice at something he should perhaps have looked at once. He did not speak to Genevieve that evening. She did not expect him to. She was a lady's companion in a pewter gown, and he was the Duke of Ashford, and there was no occasion that would have brought them together without absurdity. She went home with Mrs. Pendleton at 10:30 and sat for a long while in the small room off the kitchen that served as her parlor, with Clara asleep upstairs and the Birds of the Natural History volume open on her lap. She did not think about the Duke. She thought about the look on Clara's face before she had closed it. And she felt something long and slow move through her chest, the way water moves under ice in late February, beginning to come loose. What she also did not think about, because she had trained herself thoroughly in this art, was that 2 months earlier, Dorothea had written to Mrs. Pendleton inquiring about a suitable companion for the season, and upon learning that Mrs. Pendleton's companion was Genevieve, had replied with a single short sentence. "The girl is pleasant enough company, but her claims to the Hartwell connection should not be encouraged. She has none that need concern us now." Mrs. Pendleton had not shown Genevieve the letter. She had, however, kept it. She was that kind of woman. It was a Tuesday morning in June, before the household was properly awake, that the Duke came to collect Clara for an early riding lesson in the park. The arrangement had been made through Mrs. Pendleton, and Genevieve had not been part of the planning. She had been awake since 5, with a headache she could not resolve, and she had gone down to the kitchen to sit with the small housemaid, Polly, who had taken a fever 2 days prior and was sleeping on a pallet near the range with a damp cloth on her forehead. Genevieve had brought the Natural History volume. She had no particular intention except to be present, to be company in the way a person can be company without making demands on the sick. She read aloud from the chapter on tidal birds, keeping her voice low, watching Polly's breathing steady as the words went on. She did not hear the door at the top of the kitchen stairs open. The Duke had come through the passage rather than the front hall, because the hour was early, and he had not wished to wake the house. He stood at the top of the stairs with one hand on the doorframe and looked down at the kitchen, the fire in the range, the sleeping girl, the woman in a gray wrapper with a book open in her lap and her dark hair loose, reading about oyster catchers and the habits of the shore, her voice unhurried, as though the only thing in the world that needed doing right now was this. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes. She did not know he was there. He did not make himself known. He thought, standing in the doorway, "She is reading to a sick girl in a kitchen at dawn because someone is ill, and she is the person who was awake. Not because anyone asked her, not because anyone would know, because it was what needed doing, and she was the one present." He had not seen that kind of simple competence of the heart in a very long time. The last person he had known who possessed it had died 8 years ago in a bedroom at Ashford Park, on a night he had been away in London because he had decided it was not yet urgent, because he had told himself there was time, because he had been wrong. He went quietly back up the stairs. He collected Clara himself from Mrs. Pendleton's sitting room at 7 o'clock, as arranged. Genevieve was not present. He asked, in a manner he intended to be casual, whether Miss Hartwell was unwell. Mrs. Pendleton told him she was quite well, only up early. He said that was satisfactory. He said nothing further on the subject. He took Clara to the park and watched the child, who had clearly been taught to ride very gently and with attention, which was not the work of any groom. And he thought about the woman in the kitchen and her unhurried voice, and the matter of the tidal birds. It was 2 weeks after this that Dorothea arrived in London. She came with her 2 daughters, and a very good set of luggage, and the settled air of a woman completing a campaign she had planned carefully from the beginning. She took a house in Cavendish Square. She called upon Lady Festing, who was connected to the Duke through his late mother. She arranged, through Lady Festing's assistance, to be placed at a dinner where the Duke would be present. Genevieve heard of this through Mrs. Pendleton, who heard it from Lady Festing's cook, which was the actual channel through which London's social intelligence traveled. She received the news without visible alteration in her expression, set down her embroidery, and resumed it after a pause of approximately 4 seconds. She had expected something like this. Dorothea moved toward resources the way water moved toward low ground, patiently, relentlessly, and with no particular conscience about what was in the way. The dinner at Lady Festing's came and went. Genevieve was not present. Dorothea was charming. Cecily Vane was, it appeared, already known to her, and the 2 of them arrived at a table of 12 as though they had been arranged as a unit. Miss Vane at the Duke's right, Dorothea placed where she could monitor every line of his conversation without appearing to do so. What Dorothea said to Lady Festing afterwards, in the drawing room while the men remained with their port, was this: that poor Miss Hartwell, the companion Mrs. Pendleton had taken on, was a natural object of compassion, given her father's decline and the rather unfortunate confusion about the Hartwell property. But she ought not to be encouraged to present herself in company where her diminished connections could produce awkwardness. One felt for the girl, truly, but clarity was a kindness. Lady Festing relayed this to Mrs. Pendleton the following afternoon. It was the first voicing. Mrs. Pendleton told Genevieve, gently, that Dorothea had been speaking about her. Genevieve said, yes, she usually is. The season moved forward in the way seasons do, with the same balls recurring on different premises, the same faces in different arrangements, the same verdicts delivered at slightly varying volumes. Genevieve accompanied Mrs. Pendleton where she was required, and stayed near the walls where she was not. She was not ignorant of the fact that the Duke had begun to appear in the same rooms more frequently than probability alone would have produced. She was not ignorant of the fact that when he did appear, his attention seemed to find the corner of the room where she was standing before it found anything else. She was, however, very well trained in the art of not trusting what she saw when it concerned herself. The encounter in the Colforth Library happened on a Wednesday evening in late June, when a summer storm had chased half the garden party inside and the house was crowded and hot and smelled of damp wool and tuberose. Genevieve had retreated to the library for 15 minutes of quiet and was standing at the window watching the rain come sideways across the park when the Duke came in. He shut the door behind him. He said, without preamble, "The rain will not stop for another half hour at least." "I know," she said. "I do not mind it." He came to stand at the window as well, several feet of deliberate distance maintained between them. Outside, the rain moved in sheets through the lime trees. After a considerable silence, he said, "Mrs. Pendleton tells me you have been reading to Clara." "A little. She speaks of it with some frequency." A pause. "She told me you had a discussion about fish." Genevieve permitted herself the very small smile that was her limit in his presence. "We reached no firm conclusions." He looked at her then, in the way he rarely permitted himself to look at her directly. and she felt the quality of it differently than she had before. Not as the assessment of a powerful man deciding what category she fell into, but as something quieter and considerably more careful. He looked, she thought, the way a man looks who has decided he is going to say something and is choosing the right words with the same attention a surgeon gives to a particular instrument. He said, "Miss Hartwell, on the morning in June when Polly was ill, I came through the kitchen passage. Her breath stilled, but she did not look away. I heard you reading," he said. I did not announce myself. A pause in which the rain was very loud. I should have done. She did not know what to say to this. She said, with the careful honesty that had always been her only reliable tool, "You would have stopped if you had." "Yes," he said. A single short word with a great deal of weather in it. He turned back to the window. Outside, the rain continued its business. After a moment, he said, in a quieter register, "My wife died 8 years ago. At Ashford Park. In the night." He stopped. I was in London. I had decided there was sufficient time. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The sentence had no ending that changed anything. She stood with that for a moment. Then she said, as carefully as she knew how, "You were not the doctor, and you were not God. You were a man who had been told there was time." She paused. Grief has a talent for making itself feel like guilt. I think that is the deepest thing it does to us. He was very still. She could not see his face now. He was looking at the rain. He said finally, "That is the most direct thing anyone has said to me on the subject in 8 years. I am sorry if it was impertinent." It was not impertinent. Another pause. It was the first honest thing. The rain began, as he had predicted, to ease. They stood at the window until it had softened to a drizzle, and then he said he ought to return to the party. And she said yes. She supposed she should as well. He held the door for her. She did not make the mistake of reading too much into a man holding a door. She made the mistake anyway, quietly, alone in the pewter gown, walking back into the noise and the tuberose and the reassembled world. 3 days later, Dorothea came to Mrs. Pendleton's house in Marylebone. She did not come to see Genevieve. She came to call on Mrs. Pendleton, who was an old acquaintance and who received her in the front parlor with the slightly compressed expression of a woman who knows a performance when one arrives at her door. Genevieve was in the hallway when Dorothea was admitted, and the two women regarded each other for a moment with the particular attention of people whose most important conversations have all been conducted indirectly. Dorothea said, pleasantly, that she was glad to see her stepdaughter looking well, that London clearly agreed with her, that service suited some natures better than others, and wasn't it fortunate that Mrs. Pendleton had been so kind as to provide a situation. Service. That was the word she chose, not employment. Not position. Service. Genevieve said she was very glad to see Lady Dorothea looking so well also, and went upstairs. She heard the visit from above, through the floorboards, which transmitted the lower register of Dorothea's voice with some fidelity. She could not make out the words. She did not need to. The shape was familiar. The gentle installation of the narrative. The careful placement of the understanding that Genevieve was a person to be managed with compassion rather than a person to be taken seriously. That evening, at the Marchmore card party, Dorothea found occasion to speak to Lady Festing again. This time within the hearing of Mrs. Aldous Prewitt, who was visiting London from Suffolk, and who knew both the Hartwell family and the Duke's late mother, and who later reported to her husband what she had heard. Dorothea had said, "Poor Genevieve. The girl has her father's impractical temperament, which made him beloved and made him a very poor manager of property. She never did have a great deal of claim to the Hartwell connection. But one prefers not to dwell on that in public. One simply does what one can. The second voicing. In a room with named witnesses, each of whom carried their own weight of social standing. Mr. Prewitt heard this from his wife that same night, sitting in their lodgings in Bloomsbury over a late supper. He was a careful man, a man who kept records because records had a way of becoming necessary, and he sat with his wife's account of the evening for a long time, eating his supper without comment. Then he went to the writing desk and wrote a brief letter to the Duke of Ashford's man of business. He did not send it yet. He waited. Because careful men wait for the moment when waiting is no longer an option. That moment came sooner than any of them expected. The Colforth Ball in late July was the centerpiece of the season's last serious week. Half of Mayfair was there, the Festing family, the Marchmoors, Cecily Vane in white with diamonds at her throat that had come from somewhere with considerable ambition attached. Dorothea was present in a gown of dark blue silk, her two younger daughters arranged at her sides, her expression that of a woman who has spent the summer placing pieces on a board and has arrived at the evening of the final move. Genevieve had come as Mrs. Pendleton's companion, which placed her at the margins of everything and at liberty to disappear when the margins became crowded. She had been standing near the window for 20 minutes when Dorothea found her. There were witnesses. That was what would matter later. There were always witnesses at the kind of event where a person intends to say something publicly clarifying. Dorothea said she had been hoping to speak to Genevieve all evening. She said it with warmth, in a voice designed to carry the length of the space it occupied. She said that it had come to her attention that Genevieve had been, perhaps innocently, allowing certain acquaintances to understand that she retained some connection to the Hartwell family, and that she felt, as Genevieve's stepmother, that it was her duty to prevent any further misunderstanding on this point. She produced, from the small bag on her wrist, a folded card on which she had reproduced, in miniature, the altered portrait. The Hartwell family, rendered in oils. Her husband, the two daughters, the extended background where the left edge had once held a pale-dressed figure. She held it out so that the small group who had gathered, drawn by the peculiar magnetism of a social correction in progress, could see it plainly. She said, with great gentleness, "Your name is no longer part of this family's story, my dear. The portrait makes it quite clear. It has always been quite clear. One simply hoped you would not require the reminder." The third voicing. In the fullest public setting yet, with the card as physical evidence, with the altered portrait as documentation of a verdict delivered by paint and oil, and the casual authority of a woman who had, for 2 years, experienced no consequence for anything she had done. The small group near the window had grown. Genevieve stood in the wreckage of it, with her hands at her sides and her face held perfectly still, and she thought, quite precisely and without self-pity, that she had expected something like this since October of the year of her father's death, and that the expectation had not made it less terrible, and that she would not give Dorothea the satisfaction of understanding this. She said nothing. She turned and walked toward the corridor. She was looking for Clara's shawl. She had left it on a chair in the side room when the child was sent upstairs with the Festing nursemaid an hour ago, and she had not thought of it until this moment. But she had promised Clara she would return it. And a promise to a child was a thing that did not yield to public humiliation. She found the shawl, a small green wool thing with a fraying edge, exactly where she had left it, and she stood for a moment in the empty side room with it folded in her hands. She could leave. She knew this. The corridor led to the entrance hall, and from the entrance hall she could retrieve her own things and be in a carriage and gone inside of 10 minutes. Dorothea had designed the evening to produce exactly this exit, the disgraced companion removing herself neatly, making the room easier, making the hierarchy feel smooth again. She looked at the shawl. She thought of Clara's steady eyes and her considered opinions about the happiness of fish. She went back through the corridor and into the ballroom. The room had rearranged itself in the way that rooms rearrange when something has occurred. The clusters of conversation had a slightly altered quality, a heightened attention. The way a room sounds when everyone is being careful not to look directly at what they are looking at. Genevieve walked along the wall with Clara's shawl over her arm and her face held at the angle that cost her something to maintain. And she had taken perhaps 20 steps when she became aware of a change in the room's attention that was not related to her at all. It was related to the Duke. He had come through the main entrance from the terrace side, and he had not come alone. He had Mr. Prewitt with him, which was unusual, and he was walking with the particular quality of a man who has already decided where he is going and has no interest in being intercepted before he gets there. The crowd parted with the unconscious fluency of people who have practiced deference all their lives. He was heading toward Dorothea. He crossed 3/4 of the room, and then he stopped, because Genevieve was in his path, and when he stopped, he was standing perhaps 6 feet from her. And the room had now understood that something was happening and had adjusted accordingly. Faces turning, conversation dropping to a lower register, the particular held quality of 200 people deciding, collectively, to pay attention. He said, "Miss Hartwell." Not Mrs. Pendleton's companion. Not the Hartwell girl. Not the poor creature from the portrait business. Her name, spoken in a ballroom full of people who had, for the better part of the summer, been carefully encouraged to understand that it was a name without consequence. He said, "I believe you have been waiting for Mr. Prewitt." She had not known to wait for Mr. Prewitt. She had known nothing about Mr. Prewitt's letter, or the deed, or the Duke's carriage crossing London that afternoon to collect the solicitor from his Bloomsbury lodgings and bring him to the Colforth ball because the Duke of Ashford had decided that the correct time to produce documentation was in the same room where false documentation had been deployed. Mr. Prewitt stepped forward. He was a small man, tidy, with the quiet authority of someone who has kept important papers for a long time and understood perfectly the weight they carried. He produced from his coat pocket a folded document, sealed with the Hartwell estate seal, and he said in a clear, steady voice that the nearest 30 people could hear without difficulty, that he held in his hand the original deed of settlement, executed by Sir Edmund Hartwell in the 2nd year of his illness, settling Hartwell Grange, valued at approximately £3,000, upon his eldest daughter Genevieve Hartwell directly, witnessed and recorded in the county records, and that any representation to the contrary was a misrepresentation that he, as solicitor to the estate, was obliged to correct wherever it occurred. The room was very quiet. Genevieve looked at the document in Mr. Prewitt's hands. She had not known it existed. Her father, in the careful weeks of his last clear season, had done this without telling her, had perhaps known she would protest, had perhaps known she would find some principled reason to defer to Dorothea's management of the situation if she were given the opportunity. He had not given her the opportunity. He had simply ensured that the record would survive what she could not. The Duke was looking at her. Not at Dorothea, not at the document, not at the room, at her. He said, clearly enough for the near crowd to carry it outward into the larger room. Genevieve Hartwell is the daughter of Sir Edmund Hartwell and the rightful owner of Hartwell Grange. I would be grateful if this were understood. That was all. No long speech. No declaration. The sentence was short and specific and irrevocable, and it landed in the ballroom the way a stone lands in still water, with a particular unhurried certainty. and the rings went outward from it through every conversation in the room. Dorothea stood 10 feet away. Genevieve watched her face perform, in compressed sequence, the recalculation of a woman whose confidence has been organized entirely around the belief that no one with sufficient authority would contradict her. The small reproduced portrait card was still in her hand. She looked at it once, quickly, and then she looked at Mr. Prewitt. And something in her expression recognized, with a precision that was almost physical, that the thing she had done 2 years ago to a painting was not, in fact, the same as having done it to a deed. Cecily Vane, standing near the refreshments table, read the room with the quick intelligence of a young woman who had spent a season learning to assess the direction of social wind, and she looked at the Duke's face, and she took one careful step backward and then another, until she had moved herself quietly out of the immediate frame of what was happening. She was not destroyed. She was simply no longer the relevant figure in this particular arrangement, and she had the acuity to understand it. Lady Festing, standing near the entrance, turned to her husband and said something very quietly. He nodded. Someone near the terrace doors began to speak again, and then someone else did, and the room returned to its own noise. But it was a different noise now. Rearranged, carrying the Duke's sentence through it like a thread. Genevieve stood with Clara's shawl over her arm, and the weight of the last 2 years pressing in a way that was not grief exactly, but was the thing that lives on the other side of it, the moment when the locked door opens and the air comes in, and a person does not know whether to weep or to breathe. She looked at the Duke. He said quietly, for her alone, "I should have come sooner." She thought of the kitchen at dawn, and the library in the rain. And the way he had said it was the first honest thing she said, with the careful precision that had always been her only reliable instrument. "You came when you had what was needed." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out his hand, not to lead her anywhere, not to make a further public statement, simply to offer her the anchor of another person's hand, in a room that had spent an entire summer regarding her as a person who had no anchor to reach for. She took it. Dorothea left the Colforth ball at 20 minutes past 10, with her daughters and her luggage of social confidence considerably reduced. She said nothing further that evening to anyone who recorded it. She returned to Cavendish Square and composed a letter to Mr. Prewitt requesting a meeting about the Hartwell estate accounts. Mr. Prewitt replied, in writing, that he would be pleased to address any questions she had regarding the settlement, which was clear, and the deed, which was registered, and the £400 per annum she was entitled to as a widow's allowance under her late husband's will, which was a fixed and not a negotiable figure. She received this letter in a quiet room in Cavendish Square and sat with it for some time. And whatever she felt privately, and she expressed to no one, which was the only mercy the narrative could offer her, and it was offered. If this story has found you somewhere you needed it, leave a word in the comments. The telling matters, even when the telling is quiet. The coda of this story belongs to Ashford Park, because that is where the Duke went when London was finished with him, and because Genevieve went with him, which was not a simple fact, and took some weeks to become a settled one. There was a conversation first, in Mrs. Pendleton's front parlor, with Mrs. Pendleton conspicuously absent in the way that women of her character contrive to be absent when they are in fact listening very carefully from the adjoining room. There was a proposal, which was short and direct in the manner of all this man's important sentences, and there was a yes, which was also short, and between those two sentences there was a silence in which two people, who had each spent years being alone in the particular way of people surrounded by others, allowed themselves to understand that this was not something they needed to keep doing. Clara was told at supper, She received the news with the solemnity it deserved, and then she said, very carefully, that she was glad. And then she asked whether she might continue to have the natural history volume. And Genevieve said yes, certainly. It was hers in every way that mattered. And Clara accepted this with the quiet satisfaction of a child who has learned to measure the reliability of a promise. They came to Ashford Park in November, when the elms along the eastern drive had released most of their leaves, and the sky held the low pewter light of the season turning toward winter. Mrs. Tabitha Cook, the housekeeper, had kept the house in the disciplined way of a woman who had served the Weston family for 30 years and intended to continue doing so with the same rigor, regardless of who occupied the upstairs rooms. She met Genevieve at the door with a directness that was not quite warmth and not quite reserve, but something between the two that felt to Genevieve exactly like honesty. Tabitha looked at her with the specific attention of a woman who has been in service long enough to read a person's character from the manner in which they hold a cup, and said, with the brevity of her kind, "The house has been waiting for someone who knows how to be quiet in it." Genevieve understood this was a form of welcome. She learned the house across November and into December, its rooms and its particular silences, the way the wind came through the north corridor and made the candle flames lean east, the way the kitchen smelled of clean flour at 6 in the morning, the way the library held the light until later than any other room because of the south-facing windows that the previous Duke had ordered added sometime in the last century. She found Polly a situation in the household when it became clear that Mrs. Pendleton's establishment was to be wound down after Christmas. Clara had her own room at Ashford Park now, with a window that looked toward the stable yard, and the natural history volume on the shelf beside the bed. In January, a light snow arrived from the north and stayed for a week. It was the kind of snow that falls in straight lines and coats the park in a silence so particular that sounds from inside the house. A door, a fire shifting in its grate, a foot on the stair, seemed to carry a clarity they did not ordinarily possess. On a Tuesday evening, with the fire in the drawing room doing its steady, reliable work, and Clara long asleep upstairs, and the house settled into the deep quiet that large houses achieve when everyone in them is at rest, Genevieve sat at the pianoforte near the west window and played very quietly the first pages of a sonata she had not played since her father's house. She had not played it since then, because the house in Marylebone had no pianoforte, and she had not thought to miss it until the Ashford Park instrument was pointed out to her, and she sat down and put her hands to the keys and felt the specific and almost painful pleasure of something returning that one had not known was gone. She played 2 pages. She stopped. Not because she had forgotten the notes, but because the 3rd page had always been her father's favorite part, and she needed a moment. She was not alone. She was aware of this without turning. The Duke had come in from the hall at some point during the 1st page, and had taken up his position near the fire, which was where he often stood in the evenings, his elbow on the mantelpiece, and his face in the half-dark, and his particular stillness doing its work. She had learned to understand his stillness now, not as coldness, but as attention. The way a person who has lived much of his life being looked at develops, over time, the ability to look. He said nothing. She played the 3rd page. Outside the west window, the snow was falling again, small and steady and indifferent to the business of the people inside, falling through the dark on the park and the drive and the elms and the stone walls of Ashford Park, covering everything equally, the way snow has always covered everything, old and new and altered and restored alike. The fire ticked once in its grate. The music went on. Genevieve played, and the Duke stood in the firelight, and the snow fell without announcement outside the window. They had both, without discussion, come to understand as theirs. And somewhere upstairs, Clara slept with the tidal birds open on the quilt beside her, and the house was warm, and her name was everywhere inside it.